there. With Jordan Peterson back on the scene and with my mind on the question, what is truth? I revisited a dialogue he had with Bret Weinstein on Joe Rogan a few years ago, and truth as articulated by Jordan Peterson is what started everything, really. When you think about it, what started this whole line of questioning and philosophizing, let's just say in this corner, and related channels. And he really describes truth, I think, in a very parallel way to Persic and the latest chapters in Lila, which is what we're working on. So I'm sorry that it's taking me so long to get to chapter 10. I hate editing out all my reading mistakes, so I tend to procrastinate, which of course is not an excuse. So I'll have it out soon, maybe tomorrow. So let's listen to a little bit of this, and then I'll comment through what I understand to be the Persic lens at this point of my study of Persic's work.
The problem is, what I hear you arguing, and you tell me if I have it wrong, is that we should therefore expect the encoded metaphorical truths in these religious traditions to be morally right. But there's nothing that actually says it will be morally right, because there are metaphorical truths that might in fact be reprehensible, but nonetheless effective. And so what I would argue, the overarching point here would be that you're right that the documents that contain these descriptions of things are full of things that are true in some sense that is not literal scientific truth, nor was that their purpose. What isn't true is that those things are inherently up to date.
The problem with the Bible from this perspective is that people expect to find the absolute in the Bible, and that this truth is outdated, which makes the Bible wrong. That is the perception that a lot of people have. Now, this point of view is more nuanced than Dawkins, who Bret criticizes in this interview. Dawkins thinks it's just a bunch of superstition, and it's just kind of a mind virus or whatever. And Bret will acknowledge that this truth once had relevance. So he's nicer than Dawkins, but he still suffers from the same problem, that he conceptualizes truth in this context as what he's arguing against, or what he's embedded within the context of truth being absolute, even though he doesn't agree with absolute truth, if you get my meaning. He's still underlying everything. His definition of truth is absolute, but his disagreement is from an evolutionary science perspective. So when he disagrees with absolute truth, it's from that perspective. So it's still in the subject-object world. It's still a physical science. And it's still a world based on the presupposition that objectivity is possible in the absolute sense. And it's up to science to continually update this objective reality. But when you reach that objective reality, it is an objective reality, which is sort of right in the metaphysics of quality in a way if you're looking at static patterns, very enduring static patterns. But he's arriving at it in the wrong way, because he still lives in the material understanding of reality, where the ephemeral, the spiritual, the religious is emergent, and where values are really just basic survival mechanisms, good and bad, going forward, going away from something, are survival mechanisms with a biological basis ultimately. And while he admits the Bible's truth are not scientific, he doesn't see that the wisdom of itself is what counts. So we'll get to that.
I would say my understanding of the great myths has that observation built into it. So one of the archetypes is that of the tyrannical father, which is the archetype, by the way, that possesses the minds of people who accuse Western society of being patriarchal. They're possessed by a singular archetype, and that's the archetype of the tyrannical father. They don't see that there's a tyrannical father and a wise king, because there is. That's you can't even point that out. But anyways, in some of our oldest stories, there's a representation of the dead past. So let me give you an example that everyone knows about. The story of Pinocchio is the story of the individualization of Pinocchio. He starts out as a puppet. He's a marionette. He's a wooden head. He's a liar. And he's pulled by forces that he does not understand. Right, okay, but he has a good father. That's Geppetto. And so he's got and Geppetto wishes that he becomes a real individual. And he knows that that's an impossible wish. He wishes on a star that his son could become an actual individual, knowing full well that that's unlikely and impossible. So Geppetto's a good king. But the story is also about Geppetto, because what happens is that when Geppetto loses Pinocchio, loses his son, which you could think about as the active, dynamic, attentive force of youth, then he ends up stultified in the belly of a whale, which is a symbol of chaos, at the bottom of the ocean. And then Pinocchio has to rescue him. So I would say there is an instantiation of evolutionarily accumulated wisdom in the great stories of the past, but they're still dead. And it requires the union. This is why in Christian theology, the Godhead has a tripartite structure. This is part of the reason. There's God the Father, but the Father's dead. The Father was right 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago and is still partly right, but he's dead. He can't participate in the updating of the process. So you need an active force. Now, the active force is the same thing that generated those stories across time, right? So it's the same thing, except it's also alive in the present. And so your moral duty, and this is another thing that happens in Pinocchio, is to rescue your dead father from the belly of the whale.
Now, Jordan rebuts by going a step down, closer to metaphysical reality, but one based in narrative, which separates it from true metaphysics. So this is a metaphysical narrative, and that's it's in terms of metaphysics, it's not ultimately metaphysical because it is narrative, but for a narrative, it is absolutely spot on. It's very similar in metaphysical as a metaphysical narrative to the Pajot brothers. However, you'll see with this metaphysical narrative that it shows us a pattern, like the Pajots say, which is why they really got along on this issue. There are two sides to everything, and that's a metaphysical narrative that really begins to express in story form, let's say, how reality plays out. That something can sometimes be good, but sometimes be bad, and this is necessary in this narrative structure. Now, this age-old narrative about, in this case, Pinocchio, the dead wood puppet, and the father who's shut down, who's soporific, this begins to enter the territory of metaphysics of quality, and the narrative itself, because the narrative itself expresses the dynamic of the essential metaphysics of quality, the way static and dynamic work together. Compare it with the tale of the Brujo that we just read. The priests preside over a once vibrant culture that is killing itself, basically by not letting in the invaders, because the invaders will kill them if they stick to their guns. And the Brujo knows this. And he has to integrate this dynamic element, the outsider, the invader, so that the tribe can update its approach and survive. It's the standard hero myth, really, and illustrates exactly how the metaphysics of quality describes how quality updates the static patterns and creates reality, which is always unfolding and evolving as the dynamic element shakes things up and then things restructure with being informed by the static pattern. And that is something, by the way, that Ken Wilber, this runs through Ken Wilber's work. In the context of the tribe, this dynamic element forces it to improve, the Indian tribe in Lila. And those evolutionary stories of the past that they're referring to, these biblical stories with their great wisdom, they're still dead, but they are high quality static patterns that have degenerated, so they become dead, but they are still valuable. There's wisdom in there to be gleaned, to be dug out, let's say, to be shaken up and let loose. It is the value of these static patterns that form the basis of what is then transformed by dynamic quality into something new and better. The dynamic youth of Pinocchio rescuing the static age, the father. So the youth, with the power of youth, the dynamic power of youth, rescues that element within the old and decrepit and degenerate. The active force is obviously dynamic quality, obviously, and the Father, the static pattern. Let's just look at the Trinity. The Father is the static pattern. The Holy Spirit is dynamic quality, and the Son is the manifestation of the updated pattern, or the Brujo, the one who receives receives the Holy Spirit from the Father and uses it to create a dynamic situation, to create a better situation, to create improvement, let's say. The moral duty, Jordan Peterson explains, is exactly what makes the metaphysics of quality moral system based on the best values as they emerge, as they evolve.
And that's partly what I'm trying to do with these biblical lectures, because your objection is correct. The reason it's correct is because even if the solution was correct, the landscape has changed. And it's changed incrementally or in a revolutionary way. We don't know. And so those old truths are at best partial and at worst blind. But that doesn't mean you can just say, like Mao did during the Cultural Revolution, well, let's just destroy the past. It's like, no, that would be like saying, well, you don't need a body anymore, because your body is the collected wisdom of the evolutionary process across 3.5 billion years.
I absolutely agree. Because the stories are not literal, it's impossible to know whether they, well, not impossible, but very difficult to know whether or not the truth that is contained metaphorically is still relevant, if it's been inverted and it's now absolutely false, or
And here, with the reference to Mao, is what happens when there is only dynamic quality. It has no basis, no natural way to take hold. It's the only way in that case to make it take hold is to force it into a static state, to enforce that dynamic quality. And the only way to maintain it is to devolve into a cultural immune system, which is held together with force, and it doesn't evolve naturally. The natural outcome of the other side of too much dynamic, of course, is too much static. And here you see that Bret still doesn't get it, although he does identify the dynamic perception of degenerating patterns and low quality.
So Carl Jung talked about this a lot, hey? And one of the things he said was that your moral duty is to realize the archetype in the confines of your own life. And so you say, well, there's an archetype of perfection that pervades the West, and for the sake of argument, I'm going to call that Christ, the Christ image. It's something like that. That's the archetypal image. Now, we have a story about what Christ's historical life was like. Well, you can't have that life, because you would have had to be in the Middle East 2,000 years ago. That's not your life. But what you can do is take the archetype, and you can manifest it within the confines of your own life. And what that does is force you to undergo the difficult process of updating the ancient wisdom. And you don't just forego it. You can't, or you can, but you'll pay a massive price. And part of that will be social disintegration, because it's the past is alive enough so that those of us who inhabit its corpse aren't clawing each other to death while we're feeding, right? That's the critical issue. Now, it's not alive enough because the bloody thing could fall apart at any moment, and we need to be awake and alert in order to keep it updated and maintained.
Now here, Peterson partially leaves the metaphysics of quality in terms of the pattern, the mechanism, and identifies very high-quality static patterns, which are these archetypes, which are very high quality because they are layers and layers of the sum total of human and maybe even before experience. Jordan Peterson would argue that they go all the way back to the beginning of time. And, Persig would say the same thing. And they're very high quality because they are so permeable. They are a basic pattern. These archetypes are basic patterns of human, let's say, dynamics or complexes or experience. And they allow for updating. That's built into them, but they are still representations of a static pattern, which seem eternally valid, and maybe are for humans. Maybe they are eternal for humans because we're here on the planet for a certain amount of time, and that's it. But these archetypes are not valid for all of reality in the big infinite picture. Only the movement of quality itself is valid writ large for a dynamic universe. Of course, Jordan is describing what happens if you consciously block out dynamism, if you block out outside elements on purpose.
Well, not only that, but the greatest hazards to us in the present are only partially going to be dealt with in these texts, and that's my biggest concern. Is that, if we take, Dawkins dismissing religion as mind virus, this is very dangerous because it neglects the truth that you're talking about, and it prevents us from getting to a conversation in which we can talk about the fact that religions are not mind viruses. They are adaptations to past environments. They do contain a kind of truth that isn't necessarily literal and is in general not literal. But none of them, no ancient religion is up to date for Google's algorithms being the hazard to civilization that it probably is.
Again, Bret isn't quite getting it. As open-minded as he is, he still hasn't made the metaphysical shift. And I should say, Bret is way better than Sam Harris. We know that. But Bret still hasn't made that metaphysical shift that you need to make to see things through this lens, which is why he can't see the true value of the biblical texts. He thinks that the death of these texts, the degeneracy of these texts is a permanent thing, and you need a new thing. He still sees them as archaic, and that brings us to the definition of truth. So I'm going to read Pirsig's definition of truth from chapter 8 of Lila. If quality or excellence is seen as the ultimate reality, then it becomes possible for more than one set of truths to exist. Then one doesn't seek absolute truth, which Bret is kind of mired in, let's just say. He can't let go of that, One seeks instead the highest quality intellectual explanation of things with the knowledge that if the past is any guide to the future, this explanation must be taken provisionally as useful until something better comes along. One can then examine the intellectual realities the same way one examines paintings in an art gallery, not with an effort to find out which one is a real painting, but simply to enjoy and keep those that are of value. There are many sets of intellectual reality in existence, and we can perceive some of them to have more quality than others. But that we do so is, in part, the result of our history and current patterns of value. So we have limitations. We're limited by our mythos, let's just say. Which means that even if you're not full on metaphysics of quality, you can certainly, obviously, detect these within the context of your limitations, detect quality. So it's not like it's not available to you if you're, still looking at things in the materialistic way. So this explains why truth itself will often look very different. And now we can give Bret a break, like I mentioned last time. Even if you aren't full on if you haven't integrated that mystical element of dynamic quality into your rationality, let's just say, or even if you haven't realized that the mystic reality, the aesthetic continuum, and you're drawing out slices of static experience from this continuum. We can give Bret a break because his own truth, his highest quality intellectual explanation from an evolutionary perspective, is valid, but it's incomplete. And he can't see this as long as he's captivated by the ghost of reason, which has that underlying presumption that, again, there is an absolute element to truth. And we're kind of brainwashed in this way by the ghost of reason, again, because the ghost of reason has led us to believe that reason is the ultimate way to understand reality. And it's very difficult for us to extract ourselves from this. It's so compelling. There are high-quality patterns of value that seem absolute, but truth itself is not. And what Bret fails to see is that if quality is the nature of reality rather than substance, then the perception of quality is what will allow us to deal with Google. And we're doing it right now. Even though we don't know it, a lot of people are objecting to the censorship, to the political corruption. We're detecting the degeneracy of this sequestered set of values that are beginning to serve Google and preserve Google as this huge financial and influential force, the biggest in the world, let's just say, and not serve humanity, which was its original intention, or at least its presumed intention. And Google is forcing these values on the public. That underlying quality dynamic that is expressed by the basic biblical story is helping us push back against Google's degeneracy, even though we don't really know it, but we do detect it.
The stories are erroneous in detail and right in pattern. So, for example, there's an idea that one of the things that the mythological hero does is stand up against the tyranny of the state. Now, you don't have to specify the nature of the tyranny of the state. in order for that to be a truth that's applicable across different contexts. And I would say what's happened with the great religious myths is that they operate at a level of abstraction such that the abstract entities are applicable in every single environment. I'll give you an example of that. It is extremely useful to represent the phenomenology of your experience as a domain of chaos and order. That works in every single environment for every person.
Yes, that sums it up beautifully. The pattern is true.
And so the domain of order, I can describe it technically. You're in the domain of order when your actions produce the result you desire. And you're in the domain of chaos when they don't. And then I could say, well, your task is to straddle the border between those two domains, because you don't always want to be where everything that you're doing is working, because you don't learn anything. And you don't want to be where nothing you're doing is working because it's overwhelming. You want to be stable and dynamic at the same point. And the Taoists do that very nicely, because they have a chaos order conceptualization of the phenomenological landscape. And their claim is the point of maximum proper being is right at the center of the border between chaos and order. And I think that's true across contexts. So I don't think that truth ages.
Stable and dynamic at the same point. Now remember the spiritual rationality in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It's an ongoing exchange between chaos and order. You work on the motorcycle, it goes smoothly, you have gumption, there is an order to that, there's an order to that informed by this dynamic quality. When you come up against chaos, when your train stops, you have to regroup, you have to revalue, you have to pull out of your ego and allow, let's just say, Tao to help you understand the way back to harmony. Again, it's an updating. So do you see how this threads through everything is infinitely useful? The more you use it, the better things go. I think that's in the Tao. The Tao's like a bellows. The more you use it, the more you get out of it. I can't remember. It's something like that. So straddling the border is where you are when you're filled with gumption. You're challenged enough to be interested. Gumption, flow state. Yet when there's chaos, you regroup until gumption kicks in again.
Because the idea of truth is much older than the idea of objective truth. And the original notion of truth wasn't objective true. It was like the arrow flies straight and true. Right? And it meant something like reliably on its way to the appropriate destination, something like that. And when Christ said, I am the truth and the way, I can't remember the other one. Yes. The truth he was talking about wasn't an objective truth. So Sam's idea that I had somehow, taken the idea of truth that was actually objective all along and done something crooked with it is just wrong.
There is no objective truth, only provisional truth. And some of these truths are high-quality patterns of value indeed. They last a very long time, which of course makes them seem absolute. In order to see in a way that's more united, that's more inclusive, with less contradiction, in a more complete way through the metaphysics of quality lens, you need to feel a shift in perception. You need a paradigm shift in your understanding of reality. And it goes from seeing objects and thinking about the objects and the relationships of objects to being attuned with the qualities that unfolds. And in a lot of ways, Peterson's invitation to tell the truth is actually a really good tip to get you in this way of thinking, because it keeps you connected to that ongoing valuation that you sense. And as Peterson said, this sense is embodied. You know when you're being truthful because you can actually feel it. And the gumption traps may keep you from being honest with yourself, but if you get rid of those, you're honest with yourself, you will be able to feel truth. And that kind of truth, in the moment, perception of truth from that pre-intellectual awareness, that keeps you in line. So I hope that made sense, and I will see you next time.